In 586 BC, King Nebuchadnezzar of Babylon destroyed Jerusalem, but the city was later rebuilt some decades later. However, in the year 70 AD, Jerusalem would be destroyed again, this time by the Romans. Interestingly, this story began in 66 AD, 4 years before the destruction of Jerusalem. Jerusalem had been conquered by a Roman general named Pompey, who had started on the wrong footing with the Jews by entering the Holy of Holies, an act they believed desecrated the temple. Governors were set to rule over the different regions, and although freedom of religion was allowed, the relationship between the Jews and the Greeks was not exactly cordial. The Romans were referred to as Gentiles by the Jews, and both groups constantly had clashes based on their conflicting religious views and opinions. The Jews were also made to pay exorbitant tax rates for their proceeds, which culminated in a revolt known as the First Jewish Revolt in 66 AD. Gessius Florus was a Roman administrator appointed to oversee Judea. Florus's greed and love for money led him to loot treasures from the temple whenever taxes did not come in as expected. Before these corrupt acts by Florus, there had been cases of religious dissensions between the Jews and their foreign cohabitants. At one point, a Gentile mob was said to have desecrated a synagogue in Caesarea, offering sacrifices in front of the religious building. On another occasion, Roman soldiers had flashed their bare buttocks at the Jews, an act which the latter found gravely offensive. Some of the Jewish sacred scrolls had also been seized and destroyed by the Roman soldiers. To crown it all, a past interim emperor, Caligula, had ordered that a statue of him be carved and placed at the temple in Jerusalem. The Jews gave a bold response to the governor of Syria, Publius Petronius, who had been called to mediate in the matter. They told him that the emperor would have to sacrifice them and their children first before he would erect the statues. Caligula, however, did not live long enough to see his requests come to fruition, and the matter died a natural death. Infuriated by these desecrating acts that had been happening over the years, rebelling factions began to arise all over Judea. Attempting to quell these factions, Florus sent Roman troops into Jerusalem. They massacred about 3,000 Jews, and this resulted in the First Jewish Revolt. Surprisingly, the revolt went in favor of the Jews, as the Roman forces were swiftly run out of town. The rebels destroyed the homes of the rich Roman officials living in Caesarea. King Herod Agrippa II, who was considered a puppet king, was not spared, as his home was also destroyed. Florus fled from the city, leaving behind some of his subordinates. These subordinates ran to Agrippa's palace for safety and sued for peace. The Jewish rebels assured them of their safety and lured them out before going ahead to kill them. The rebels were convinced that war with Rome was inevitable, and there was no turning back. The rebellion then spread to other regions, including Galilee. The Jews stopped paying their taxes and overthrew the Roman leadership representatives and soldiers. The daily sacrifices to Caesar in the temple also stopped. One of the Roman governors, Cestius Gallus, went against the Jewish forces with 20,000 soldiers from Syria. After besieging Jerusalem for about 6 months, he was forced to withdraw. About 6,000 of his soldiers were killed, and the Jews took ownership of their weapons to defend themselves. The Roman emperor at the time, Emperor Nero, was infuriated by the audacity of the rebels. He responded by sending one of his generals, Vespasian, along with his son Titus, to Jerusalem to combat the Jewish forces and subdue them. It did not take long before the Romans reclaimed some of the regions the rebels had overrun, such as Galilee and Idumea. During this time, he captured Josephus Flavius, one of the rebel leaders who would later become a famous historian, providing written accounts of what happened during the Roman-Jewish wars. Shortly after Vespasian's military campaign against the Jews started, a civil war in Rome led to the death of Nero. By 69 AD, Vespasian had become the emperor of Rome. He immediately made Titus the military leader over the forces assigned to combat the Jewish rebellion. Thus began one of the bloodiest sieges in Roman and Jewish history. Meanwhile, some of the Jewish religious leaders, specifically the Sadducees, attempted to convince the rebel groups to surrender. In response, the rebels killed some of them and publicly hung their bodies as a warning to others who might have shared a similar opinion. None of them had any idea of the disastrous turn of events that awaited them. The siege of Jerusalem lasted about 6 months in 70 AD. The siege was led by Titus, who would later become a Roman emperor. It consisted of a series of devastating events that saw the death of thousands of Jews. The siege began on April 14th, 3 days before Passover, an annual Jewish observance. Thousands had traveled from far and near regions to the temple in Jerusalem, as was their custom. Before the Passover, there had been growing unrest within the city of Jerusalem, as well as clashes between the rebels and the Roman army. The Roman army staged a siege against the rebels, who withstood them successfully for about 3 months. Notable rebel groups were the Zealots and the Sicarii. Rebel leaders who also stood out during this time were John of Gischala, Eleazar ben Simon, and Simon bar Giora. The siege of Jerusalem was a battle of strategies. Titus deployed 2 major strategies that worked for him. The first was that he allowed the Jews in Jerusalem to fight against themselves, further weakening them. Different rebel groups had different agendas, and these divisions did little to help their military stance. The second strategy Titus deployed was to grant entry to visitors who had come into the city to celebrate Passover. They entered but were not allowed to leave. This was to ensure that the city ran out of basic supplies as quickly as possible. Sooner or later, food and water had become a scarce commodity within the city's walls. This was further compounded by the rebels' destruction of some of the dried food that had been stored by the Jews in preparation for the siege. They had done this in an attempt to force Jews to sign up for the war against Rome. This was carried out by the Zealots, led by John of Gischala. The strategy seemed to work for a while, as many male and female Jews signed up for the war. However, the strategy was obviously not thought through, as many of the citizens and soldiers starved, some dying from malnutrition. Those who tried to leave the city in search of food were caught and crucified in varying positions. The Jews were caught between the devil and the deep blue sea. Some eventually deserted and surrendered as prisoners. In the 4th month, the army was able to penetrate the outer walls of the city, but could not break through the last and thickest wall. Meanwhile, a greater difficulty faced the Jews as the famine raged and internal fighting continued. All of these resulted in multiple killings and even cannibalism, further weakening the Jewish side. People resorted to eating leather belts and other inedible substances to survive. Josephus, who now fought on the side of Titus, claims to have appealed to the rebels to surrender, but to no avail. Both sides had devised many strategies against the other, but the rebels seemed to have successfully withstood the Roman siege. Perhaps in the hearts of some of the Jews, the knowledge that it was only a matter of time before ultimate calamity struck was too painful to ponder on. By the 5th month, the Roman army had broken through the wall and set the temple on fire. The rebels still tried to withstand the Roman army, but starvation, lack of ammunition, and internal divisions due to other rebel factions sprouting up put them at a great disadvantage. They were no match for the Roman army storming into the city. Titus had marched against Jerusalem with around 60,000 troops. The Jews were nowhere close to the Romans in might, with about 24,000 soldiers and their lower-grade weaponry. After the Roman army broke through the walls, they set fire to the city and then the temple before they went on a killing spree, murdering their opposition in their thousands. The city and the temple were eventually burned to the ground, with their treasures looted and carted away to Rome. According to Josephus, no one knows who started the fire, The Roman military leader Titus tried to make his troops put out the fire, but it was their moment of revenge for all their fellow soldiers lost in the course of the siege, and there was no stopping them. Instead, they threw more wood on the fire. On the contrary, reports written by another Roman historian, Tacitus, said that Titus had ordered the burning of the temple. Some say Josephus had tried to absolve Titus of any blame regarding the burning of the temple in order to remain in favor with him. Nonetheless, the temple burned to ashes. Some believe Titus might have taken this decision after the prisoners of war informed him that the stoppage of the daily sacrifices in the temple had greatly demoralized the Jews. It is possible he deduced that burning the temple would quench every other flame of hope the Jews had, as they were a highly religious people. Hundreds of thousands died from the series of wars that took place between the Romans and the Jewish rebels. Many of the victims were unarmed and weak citizens who had been stuck in the city for months. With the temple, a symbol of hope and divine presence to the Jews, destroyed, there was no more willpower to stand against the Romans. Some sources suggest that Titus performed purification rituals or profanatory acts at the site of the now destroyed temple to celebrate his victory over the Jews. This was considered blasphemy by the Jews, but at that point there was nothing to defend anymore. Some of the rebels escaped, and small pockets of fighting continued for many months after. The celebration continued in Rome as the Roman soldiers paraded the streets in procession, carrying the menorah, a 7-stand candlestick, the table on which the showbread, also known as bread of God's presence, was placed, and sacred vessels from the Holy of Holies, which had been kept from public eyes for so long. Thousands of Jews, mainly women and children, were sold into slavery. The men were subjected to a life of hard labor in Egypt, while some were used as entertainment, devoured by wild animals during the gladiatorial games. Many of the Jews who were taken to Rome are said to be those who built the famous Roman Colosseum and the Forum of Peace. Some of the rebel leaders also suffered gruesome fates. John of Giscala was sentenced to life imprisonment, while Simon Bar Giora was tortured and executed. The Roman-Jewish War came to a complete halt in 74 AD, with the Romans reclaiming the Masada fortress after most of its 960 inhabitants had committed mass suicide. Although the Romans had utterly destroyed the physical symbols of Jewish religion, Judaism survived, taking other forms. The Jews were forbidden from rebuilding the temple by the Romans, and this greatly impacted the religious history of the Jews and Judaism. The Sanhedrin Council was also dissolved, which led to the rise of Rabbinic Judaism. Christianity also spread with the dispersal of its followers who survived the siege. Some Christians believed that the destruction of the temple had been prophesied by Jesus Christ. They also believed that the temple was destroyed because the Pharisees and Sadducees had rejected Jesus as the Messiah. To this day, the Jews still have hope in the rebuilding of a third temple, and prayers are offered every day for the restoration of the temple and the daily sacrifices.